Welcome back to the Midnight Ride. Today's subject is the differences between what male readers want and female readers want. This is something that I touched on in a video probably a couple of months ago. It did okay. Recently, I mentioned John A. Douglas. He covered another news article about this exact subject. His video is done very well. I'll link to that one in the description. The question put out by these media outlets is, why aren't men reading? And the answer from me and from John and from other guys in this space who are reading and who are writing is that we are reading. We're just not reading the stuff that's being shoveled at us by the larger bookstores, by the Amazon algorithms, and by the front tables at Barnes & Noble, which I will say is the company as a whole has been making a comeback. It seems like 10 years ago they were right on the verge of utter collapse and defeat, but they've been able to fight that back, and they're still around, which is good. You know, everybody loves a good bookstore, and having easy access to a bookstore is great for readers and writers alike. The problem that we have is that we as a reading block, and we are out here, we do exist, we are not catered to by the larger institutions. And I was reminded of this kind of by these articles and by this analysis of it, but also by a discussion that I had with my wife earlier tonight. I tweeted about it, and then it's kind of been in my head ever since. We sat down to watch the new animated Transformers movie, the Transformers 1. I specifically avoided it in the theaters for a couple of reasons. I won't get into that here, but the main point of it is that we sat down, we started watching it, and it starts out with Optimus and Megatron. Before they became Optimus and Megatron, they had different names, but it's very obviously those characters, and they were really good friends and co-workers. And then obviously the arc is going to be that they become the leaders of their factions and they become dire enemies. And my wife said, why is it that all of these prequel stories are about how guys who were enemies later were friends in the beginning? And I was like, oh, well, it's the inversion principle, because all female rom-coms are about enemies to lovers stories, and stuff that's male-coded goes in the opposite direction. And I quoted Anakin and Obi-Wan. It's like, you were my brother, Anakin. There was even a line, I believe, in the 2007 Transformers movie where Optimus tells Megatron, like, you left me no choice, brother. I'm going to speak in generalities here, and because I am speaking in generalities, I'm going to urge you and remind you to focus on that fact that it is a generality, and so don't combat this with, well, I know this one guy. Like, anecdotes are not an effective counter to generalities because they do not disprove a generality. In fact, they reinforce that it is a generality because the exceptions exist. Here's the generality. Men prefer violence, women prefer peace. Yes, you know a girl who loves to read Conan. Yes, you love a guy who loves to read rom-coms. Those are exceptions. Those are minorities. Those are not the generality. And so stuff that is primarily marketed towards a male audience will be geared towards a story of conflict and war and violence. Stuff that is focused on a female audience will go in the opposite direction. This has been true for a very long time. The Greek playwright and comedian Aristophanes wrote about this in the Lysistrata hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. If you're unfamiliar with the Lysistrata, it's a play about two warring factions in ancient Greece, and these two groups of men were just always at war with each other, and their wives were so fed up with it that they went on a sex strike. And they told their husbands that they would not get any action if they didn't stop this stupid war, rivalry, bloodshed, all that stuff. I want to emphasize that this is distinct from the recent 4B movement that has popped up in the wake of the recent election results, where I guess it's a trend on social media sites for sexually available women to say that they are going on a sex strike and that they're not going to sleep with anybody who voted for Bad Orange Man. This is not the same thing to remove yourself from the marketplace of promiscuity. It's very different when wives go on a strike against their husbands and say, like, hey, we're going to use our influence to gear this toward peace. This reinforces, again, that generality. The men were going towards war. The women wanted peace. They were using one of their strongest assets, the sexual dynamic in marriage, to leverage that. In effect, or in a sense, this was the women going to war, but not in a violent way. They were waging peace. Men and women are geared towards different things in stories. My friend Amanda, she was a coworker of mine way back in the bookstore days. I was still in contact through Goodreads, and she's a big pusher of romance novels. And so whenever I see her reviewing one, it feels like every single time she's mentioning, like, oh, this is an enemies to lovers romance. This is an enemies to lovers story. It's like, at this point, it's almost like that's every romance. It's not just a niche or a type of romance, but the majority of it seems to be focused that way. Whereas male stories, you'll have Professor X and Magneto. They were on the same team once, but they had extremely divergent ideas about how to achieve their goals for mutant peace, for mutant acceptance, and whatever. Captain America and Bucky, that was a different situation because Bucky was brainwashed, but they were on the same page, and then they ended up fighting each other. Optimus and Megatron, Anakin and Obi-Wan. You guys can probably think of a bunch of other examples as well. In print, Devados and Ashok from the Saga of the Forgotten Warrior. Cassius and Darrow from Red Rising. This is where I'm going to emphasize something else with those two book examples. I never got around to making this video, but I noticed it last summer when I was listening to Lightbringer, the sixth Red Rising book. And then later when I was listening to Tower of Silence, which was the fourth Forgotten Warrior book, this was especially observable because both audiobooks were narrated by Tim Gerard Reynolds. But the dynamic between Ashok and Devados is very similar to the dynamic between Darrow and Cassius. Darrow and Ashok were both lower class types that were artificially elevated into the higher classes and then pitted against the golden boys of their peer group, who they then defeated and became mortal enemies of them. Cassius and Darrow eventually made up. There is a development in Graveyard of Demons in the fifth Forgotten Warrior book that I will not spoil because it just came out, but that dynamic is addressed there. In fact, I believe at the end of the third book, Ashok and Devados face off and they just have this brutal, violent battle against each other that's been cooking up not just since the first book, but ever since they were kids. Larry Correia's writing, while he does have a female audience that loves his work, is generally broadly appealing to men. John A. Douglas talked about this in his video, and there's another guy on Twitter, I don't know his name, his handle is Daddy Warpig. He's big in the tabletop gaming space, and he's been a Dungeons & Dragons fan since it first came out in, the 70s, the 80s. And he hates the way that it's been subverted and changed now because not only is it geared especially towards a female and an effeminate audience, but they're pushing out the male audience that established it and made it viable to begin with. And you see that in the print space with the tie-in lit RPG books. What the heck was this? Taverns and something or other. It was Lattes and Legends. There are coffee shop RPG books now. Interracial RPG romances about the time I got drunk and yeeted a love potion at a werewolf. This stuff is not written for men. It is written for women and effeminate men. And so when these big media outlets scratch their head in utter perplexity about, well, why aren't men reading things? We are. We are not reading this. This is not written for us, and we can tell because it doesn't have what we are interested in. In fiction, we want to read about men that are so convicted about their values that they will go to war to prove a point. That is how men solve things. And in many cases, especially when the men know each other by name and have a long relation with each other, more often than not, they'll blow off a head of steam, get into a fist fight, get it out of their system, and get back to being friends. whereas women will just be catty with each other until the end of time and never forget a single what's the freaking word that I'm like a single offense. I am speaking in generalities, but these generalities are ironclad. And in the entertainment space, we ignore them at our peril. We've seen the experiment play out over the last decade and a half, where the most influential forces in the publishing space have tried to crowbar this into a different direction. You cannot fight or alter nature. Men and women are different. They are geared toward different things. It's the storm and the tide on the sea. Your vessel adjusts to it or it sinks. And I think we're all done sinking. I'll close this out with a final point from the novel marketing podcast. I listened to it a couple of weeks ago, and there was this one point that a guest made, and forgive me, I can't remember the episode, but this guy was spot on. Because you can take the same scene, but if you're writing it towards women or writing it towards men, it's going to be very, very different. Men are interested in things, women are interested in people. Like, men want to know technical details, women want to know about relationships and personalities and such. So if you've got a scene where your protagonist is trying to defuse a nuclear bomb, if it's written for men, the man is going to be very concerned about understanding all the technical specs, and this doesn't look like it did when it was in the manual, which was written at this point. There were 3 switches, and the wires went this way. It's connected to this payload here, which yields this much, and it'll have a blast radius of this, that, and the other thing. Like, he'll get into the details as he's trying to solve this Rubik's Cube that's in front of him. Whereas a female character solving that same problem for a female audience is going to be concerned about what she wasn't able to say to this man that she loves before this is all done, and her mom is in the blast radius. She's got to get this thing taken care of, and there's going to be a supportive male character standing behind her, cheering her on, saying, "You can do this, I believe in you." That is going to be what a largely female audience wants to read. Men want to read stuff like the Terminal List, right? Women are interested in the endless supply of Hallmark romances. We joke about it, but it remains not only economically viable, but an economic stable coin, because it plays to a hard and fast fact of nature. This is all stuff that I'm figuring out how to implement into my own work. I try to strike a balance, at least. I want my work to be broadly appealing, and that means not leaning too hard in one way or the other. I feel like I did a pretty good job of that with Howling Wilderness, because there was a lot of technical and mechanical stuff with the machines that they were using and the strategies and so on and so forth. But there were also relationship motivations for Graveheart and for Mickey. Calico was very power oriented. There were other motivations that the characters had. I try to present a broad swath of humanity in my work, not for the sake of inclusion and representation. I care less about that in terms of demographics and more in terms of ideological differences, because we as human beings are ideological creatures. We are driven by our values. Sometimes those values are connected to our ethnicity or our orientation or whatever, but I would posit to you that they are more often than not connected to those things. It's just more about who we are deep down. And those things are inseparable from, at the very first step, whether we are men or whether we are women. That will drive a significant portion of what interests us, and that will be reflected in our entertainment consumption. That is all. I'm at work now. Peace. Hey, thank you for watching that. Did you know that I'm also an author? You can check the description for a link to my book, Mr. Friday. It's set in a future where Black Friday is militarized and televised, and the best Friday fighters end up getting sponsors and backing, but it just so happens that the very best of them actually wants to take the holiday down. When he's approached by a couple of other like-minded fighters, he jumps at the chance, and it goes haywire from there. This is a short novella, and it's available in ebook format for just 99 cents. Drive safe. See you out there.